Welcome to Pleasurology Island. I'm Free Thought Steve. Thanks for stopping by. Welcome to another meeting of the Pioneers of Pleasurology Club, where I'm trying to share with you, in hopes that you will then share with the rest of the world, ways of feeling happier and happier, better and better. Last time I read you a little selection from Gertrude Stein, who lived with her wife, Alice B. Toklas, in Paris from 1907 till 1946. And Gertrude Stein was a writer known for the famous phrase, "A rose is a rose is a rose." Another phrase she was known for is the phrase, "As a wife has a cow." And I heard in watching a video about Gertrude Stein from a Gertrude Stein scholar, a woman who has studied Gertrude Stein intensively. She claims that cow was Gertrude Stein's code word for orgasm. So when she talked about as a wife has a cow, she was saying as a wife has an orgasm. And the story that I read to you yesterday was about two women who came from presumably America or possibly England, anyway, a place where it was impossible for them to enjoy living where they did because they weren't allowed to be gay there. They didn't feel comfortable being gay where they lived at home. So they went to someplace else, presumably Paris, where a lot of people were cultivating their voice and other things that needed cultivating. And I think that cultivating their voice was perhaps Gertrude Stein's metaphor for cultivating their sexual arousal response system so that they could have orgasms. And they could learn to use their sexual voice having orgasms as well as they could. And they were working on cultivating that in the atmosphere of Paris, where it turns out that from the late 1800s on up through the 1920s and 30s, there was quite a subculture of lesbian women mixing with men and other gay bon vivants, good livers, those who enjoyed the art of living well. There was this community of lesbian women in Paris, and one of them was Natalie Barney, or Barney, Barney, who was a writer and actually had some money to live on, so she was independently wealthy, so to speak. She wrote novels, but she was one of the most active women in the lesbian subculture in Paris, and she had a salon where up to 200 people would come and mix and find ways of enjoying life with each other. And Natalie Barney was known for saying about her lesbian sexual orientation, "Other people say it's unnatural, but to me it's always felt perfectly natural." And that was a point that I was trying to make at the end of the show last time, at the end of the talk that I gave, which was that what is natural is what feels natural to each of us. What is natural for us to do sexually is what our own emotional brain wants to do sexually. Our emotional brain has recognition centers for recognizing situations which our emotional brain feels are sexy situations that deserve the emotional response of becoming sexually aroused. Now, we often think of sexual arousal as a physical response because it is our genitals where we feel the sexual arousal happening, and the changes in our sex organs are very evident when we get sexually aroused. So we tend to think of sexual arousal as a physical process that occurs in our body. But actually, sexual arousal is an emotional process. In fact, it's an emotional process that is generated by the emotional brain, which is this part of the brain in the center, yellow and red colored parts of the brain in the center of the brain. Here's the top of the brain. You take the two parts apart, and there in the center, you see the areas that are the emotional brain. And the emotional brain contains recognition areas for all of our basic emotions. The emotional brain has an area in the back called the amygdala, and has an area in the front called the hypothalamus, and it has an area all along here called the cingulate cortex. And all of these areas, which also connect with the temporal lobe out here where our memories are stored, this whole system has built into it genetically the ability to recognize certain situations that deserve different types of emotional response. And some of them are pleasurable types of emotional response because things are going well, like when we laugh because we're happy, or somebody has said something funny, it tickles our laughter recognition area, our funniness recognition area in our emotional brain, and we have a spontaneous emotional response of laughing to something that has happened that just tickles our emotional brain. And it could be something that, for instance, violates our normal social conventions, like me burping like that, without trying to cover it up or hide it or make it silent instead of nice and loud. That was breaking a social convention. And our emotional brain often finds it funny when somebody breaks a social convention, particularly when it's something that we would like to do too sometimes. We wish we didn't have to stifle our burps. We wish we could just burp out loud all the time. But we're constrained by society. And saying the word gay over and over again, as Gertrude Stein did in that story about Miss Fur and Miss Skeen, the two women who came to Paris in order to be as gay as possible, as much of the time as possible, in as many different ways as possible. And Gertrude uses the word gay over and over again. And to our ears, this may sound very fun or funny because she's talking about, at least to our ears, it sounds like she's talking about woman-woman sex, which is something that our society wants us not to talk about. And the traditional culture, the dinosaur culture that we're emerging from, the dinosaur culture, has said, oh gosh, we shouldn't talk about same-sex relationships, we shouldn't have them, they're shameful things that should be hidden. And for Gertrude Stein to just go on using the word gay over and over again in this story, to us, it's fun because she's breaking that social convention about talking about being gay. Now, she may not have meant the word gay as specifically lesbian. She may have meant it simply in terms of enjoying one's sexuality, however one happens to enjoy it. And when she says that women were being gay regularly, they were being gay every day. And they were being gay some days longer than others, but they were being gay as much as they needed to be be a really gay one. She may have simply meant that they were learning to cultivate their sexual responses, their emotional sexual response to life. Because in a sexually repressive culture, such as the one they grew up in, Gertrude Stein was talking about women in Paris before World War I, so before 1914. So this was the end of the Victorian era, and those women when they came to Paris, they may already have been in their 30s. So they grew up in the late 1800s. And like Gertrude Stein, she was born in the 1870s. And so they grew up with this very repressive Victorian culture that tried to hide the human body at all costs, except in art. But basically, you couldn't see the live, naked human body, particularly not the live, naked female body, in ordinary culture, in ordinary society. Everybody was clothed, from head to toe, from the neck down, and sometimes they would even be wearing gloves, but sometimes you could see a hand, You might see possibly a foot sticking out the bottom of a skirt, but the foot would have a stocking on it and shoe, and that alone would be very titillating to men who were absolutely starved of what the female body looked like. And so the women who grew up, whose emotional brains had a natural tendency to become sexually aroused by other women, could go to Paris and have interactions with other women where they could flirt with them, maybe at Natalie Barney's salon. They could meet with them, flirt with them, possibly go somewhere and do something with them. And in that way, they were giving their emotional brain a sexual history. We all have a history of the sexually arousing experiences that we have personally participated in, or that we have seen portrayed in a movie, or in a book, written in a book, or in photographs in a magazine. There are many different ways that we can vicariously have sexual experiences. The kind of experiences we can be experienced to the kind of stimulation that will activate the sexual arousal circuits in our emotional brain. And so these women would go to Paris, and where they were freer to flirt and be affectionate and sit with affectionately and put their arms around other women and really enjoy sharing a little bit of erotic energy with these other women. That was an erotic experience that their emotional brains recognized as deserving of sexual arousal and affectionate arousal, and the desire to become more intimate with a certain person. They found it sexually arousing. And then they could go off by themselves and remember those experiences that they'd had in the salon, and sitting in the corner on a couch with another woman, and they could masturbate and learn how to create orgasms for themselves, cultivate their voice, as Gertrude Stein might say, cultivate the sexual voice of their emotional brain, and learn to use that sexual voice effectively, and to learn to use it as well as it needed to be used in order to do what? Satisfy our natural biological sex drive. An orgasm is what satisfies our natural biological sex drive, and in order to have an orgasm, we have to become emotionally aroused, not just physically aroused. And this is one of the important things that should be stressed. If, for instance, a person has been deprived of sexual arousal stimulus to the point, or they have been in an environment which maybe has told them that it is shameful to become sexually aroused, an environment which has told them that their natural biological sex drive is not to be used, is not to be activated, until they get married. And they have, they've avoided becoming sexually aroused, but now they've realized that the people who told them that were full of shit. that our natural biological sex drive is a good thing, and that we should use it to give ourselves as much pleasure as possible without having any negative consequences, being cautious about not having negative consequences, but at the same time, being completely guilt-free about giving ourselves as much sexual pleasure as we possibly can, and satisfying our sex drive in the most pleasurable way that we possibly can. As Gertrude Stein would say in her little story, learning to be gay as possible in as many ways as possible. If we mean by being gay, becoming sexually aroused, enjoying being gay every day, enjoying being sexually aroused every day, and learning to use our voice as well as it needs to be used so that we have good orgasms that satisfy our biological sex drive. And Paris provided an environment for doing that. It was a learning environment, an erotic learning environment that was different from the very straight-laced, anti-sexual life in America or in England in those days, that you didn't have the chance for that kind of a sexual history. For instance, one of the most fun parts of my personal sexual history was the time that I used to spend at the nude beach where I lived, and that was adding to my own personal sexual history a whole bunch of fun, erotic experiences and memories that I could then go home and masturbate and think about and create an enormous amount of erotic pleasure in my own consciousness and have a bliss cloud fill my own consciousness for as long as I wanted, because I had learned how to relax and let that bliss cloud expand without triggering my orgasm reflex until I was ready to do so. And then once I had a long period of time, and I mean, you can go for hours easily if you have plenty of sexy experiences to remember and think about, with particular sexy people who turn you on, and that you've been there on the nude beach with them, and both of you have been turned on looking at each other's naked body, and you can know that the other person knows that you were turned on by them, and you can think that possibly they're at home giving themselves sexual pleasure thinking about you at the same time, or at least they are doing so at one time or another during the day. And that's a very erotic thought, to think that somebody else is masturbating, thinking about me, knowing that I am thinking about them and masturbating, and that we're both having a really pleasurable and wonderful, sexy time thinking about each other, even though we have done nothing but, flirt visually at the nude beach. Unfortunately, the women in Paris back, in the early 1900s didn't have nude beaches to go to. During the 1920s and 30s, a few of the avant-garde people used to go down to the French Riviera, which in those days wasn't as built up as it is now. So they could find sort of isolated places to stay on the French Riviera where there were no other people around, and they could get naked out on the beach there with each other to some extent, and there are photographs extant of them being partially or completely naked. But and in America, it was possible to do that in a few places, like near Provincetown on Cape Cod. Women could go out there and men could go out there, and they could be naked. And there are a few photographs of naked women out at the dunes on Cape Cod Louise Bryant, who was the girlfriend of John Reed, who wrote about the Russian Revolution happening in 1917, and he eventually died in Russia. But before they went off to Russia, they were together in New York, and they went out to Cape Cod, and Louise Bryant posed naked out there, and there's a picture of her naked out there. Wasn't taken by John Reed himself, but one of their other friends. So there were people who were, in the early 1900s, trying to break out of the old dinosaur culture, the old anti-sexual dinosaur culture. And since the 1960s, with the sexual revolution that occurred pretty much around the more culturally advanced parts of the world, things changed, the environment changed, and nudity was a lot more acceptable, and nude beaches began at about that time in various parts of the country. And then, of course, at the same time, erotic magazines were becoming much more popular. Playboy had been the only erotic magazine widely available before, but then Penthouse came along, and then lots of others came along, and then eventually, of course, we had VHS, video porn, and that was a major advance forward. And then at the same time, the nude beaches were in full swing, and I was going down to the nude beach and having a great time there. And so that was helping my own personal sexual development. I was gathering in a large number of really sexy experiences of the kind that were especially arousing to my personal emotional brain. See, everybody's different. We've all got our own unique turn-ons that depend on our personal history, and I'll tell you what mine were. But my point before I do that, because human sexuality is extremely diverse, and human emotional brains are very different from one another. Your emotional brain is different from mine, and our personal sexual histories are different. So each of us will have different sexual emotional memories that our emotional brain uses to recognize a sexy situation. Our emotional sexual recognition areas in the emotional brain are kind of like our language centers in the brain when we're children. We have a language learning center that's ready to learn some language, but the language that we actually do learn depends on the culture that we grow up in. We learn the language of the culture that we grow up in because we hear everybody else talking in that language. So we have all these language experiences as children, and all those language experiences are within one type of language, which is the language that our culture speaks, that everybody speaks in our culture. And somebody else growing up in a different culture will learn a different language. And even within the same language group, there will be different dialects in different parts of the country and different accents and different phrases that people use, different variations on the language that is spoken. So there is human linguistic diversity, enormous human linguistic diversity all around the globe. There is also enormous human sexual diversity. Human cultures are very different from one another in the way they approach sex. These poor women who grew up in America in the late 1800s and had to go to Paris to try and find a place to be sexual and to enjoy being sexual. If they had been born not in America, but in Samoa, the Samoa that was studied by Margaret Mead in the 1920s in her book Coming of Age in Samoa, she found that the girls there, the young girls there, they had Christian culture imposed on the island to some extent. And so the boys and the girls were segregated during puberty at night. The girls all had to sleep in a dormitory that was associated with the church and the school they were going to. But because they were growing up in a very sex-positive culture that didn't have very many sexual taboos at all, these girls who were in this dormitory, Margaret Mead took a survey of them. She was only 23 at the time she did the work herself. She was there, so she was so young that she was talking to these girls as though she was, almost their own age. And so they would gladly tell her what their sexual experience was. And so she conducted one of the very first sex surveys anywhere, and you can find it at the back of that book, Coming of Age in Samoa. And she found that among those young women that she interviewed, all of them masturbated. Without exception, they all knew how to arouse themselves sexually and satisfy themselves sexually with orgasms. And 50% of them had sexual experience with other girls there in the community. There was about a 50% same-sex interaction rate there within that little, like the dormitory, the girls' dormitory. So those women had a completely different sexual environment than the women who grew up in America just at approximately the same time or a little bit earlier. The women in America were having much more restricted sexual experiences. And in fact, before Christianity arrived and was imposed on the islands, the sexual experiences of young people were even more varied and open than Margaret Mead found when she went there after the islands had been Christianized for some decades. Before Christianity came, as you'll find in this book called Love in the South Seas by a man named Bent Danielson, Danielson, Daniel's son with two S's, and his first name is Bent, B-E-N-G-T. He was a member of the Kon-Tiki expedition after World War II that sailed from Peru on a balsa wood raft out into the Pacific Ocean and caught the current that pulled them across the ocean very slowly and finally caused the raft to shipwreck on one of the Tuamotu Islands north of Tahiti. And he lived there. That island was so isolated at the time they landed there that it was months before a boat came in that they could even let people know, where they were, and that they could, those of them who wanted to, would get back to civilization. Well, Ben Danielson liked being on the island so much that he went back and lived there. And he and his wife became part of the village culture on one of the islands. And he ended up writing this book about, just some nice pictures in it, this book about Polynesia and traditional sexuality in Polynesia. And the contrast with our culture is very extreme, because in Polynesia, first of all, they didn't think that the gods, they believed in gods, but they didn't think that the gods were worried at all about the kind of sexual interactions and activities that human beings had. The gods were interested in other things, getting the right sacrifices and doing other things, but they really didn't care much what people did sexually in their lives. So the people weren't living sexually in order to perform for an invisible imaginary being that they imagined was observing their behavior all the time. See, so that's exactly the opposite of Christianity, where people believe that Jesus and God are watching them all the time, that Jesus actually lives inside of them, so they can't be sexual without defiling Jesus and all this stuff. None of that fairy tale, hocus pocus, imaginary bullshit. The Polynesians just found sex to be one of the pleasures of life, like eating food, enjoying delicious food. And so they had a quite relaxed attitude toward the sexuality of young people. And that's when we learn our sexual history. Is in childhood, we have a childhood period of sexual interest and sexual activity and sexual exploration. I'll show you mine if you'll show me yours. Let's play doctor and nurse. And then, so that's the childhood period, anywhere from age 3 to 7. And then at puberty, our interest in sex intensifies, and we go through a critical period of learning from puberty on in through our teenage years and into our young adulthood. And the experiences that we have and the partners that we have at that time will create very powerful and strong emotional memories in our emotional brain, assuming that we are allowed to have those experiences. And the women who'd grown up in Victorian America weren't allowed to have any of those experiences at all. So they had to go to Paris in order to be in a freer atmosphere and begin to find out how to develop their sexual arousal response. But in Polynesia, the parents weren't worried about the kids experimenting sexually. If you're living on a little island out in the middle of nowhere, if there were any sexually transmitted diseases at all in the population, everybody's developed an immunity to them by now. So they didn't have to worry about young people's sexual activity transmitting sexually transmitted diseases. We live in an urban culture where none of us is an island. Unless we completely avoid having sexual activity with anybody, that's the only way we can be an island. But as soon as we have sex with even one person, we are potentially opened up to the entire rest of the population, depending on who that person has had sex with and who that person has had sex with all the other people who they, we are living in a very permeable environment for sexually transmitted diseases. So our situation is in fact very different from Polynesia. But in Polynesia, there we can see what I think would be an ideal type of environment for having the kind of sexual history that would allow all individuals to develop their capacity for sexual arousal and sexual pleasure as much as possible, and learn how to have really satisfying orgasms, and learn who it is they spontaneously are sexually attracted to. This is an ideal situation for sexual learning. We could not recreate that in our own society unless we did isolate groups of children and allowed them to grow up together and to interact with each other sexually, but not interact with anybody outside of their community. It would be establishing an artificial community for the young children. And that has been done in India by a group of people called the Muria, M-U-R-I-A. And they have an institution in their villages, which is the young people's dormitory. When children are 6 or 7 years old, they leave their parents' house at nighttime. They start spending the nights in the young people's community hostel, basically, a little a hut, actually a large hut, where they all sleep together, and they pair off as they grow older. They pair off, and they do have sexual relations with certain members of that community, and so they learn about actual sexual experience in a safe environment. And then they go out and they get married, and they have fully developed their sexual arousal response patterns. And they don't have any shame about sexuality at all. In Polynesia, it was a similar atmosphere, but it was different because the young women, I think the young teenage women, did have a house, a hut, where they stayed in a lot of the villages. That was the girls' hut, and they would entertain male visitors there during the evening, and probably have lovers there. But also, if girls slept at their own house, houses in Polynesia where it's very warm are oftentimes just poles in the ground with a palm thatched roof overhead, and they have sort of blinds that they can unroll down on the sides in case it's windy and cool. But most of the time it's so warm they don't even need to have those down. But at night everybody sleeps in this house, and there are no actual walls to the house. So there was the custom of night creeping or night crawling, where a young man would visit a young woman in her parents' house and just do it so quietly that the parents wouldn't wake up, and have sex with the girl if she was willing and cooperative. Of course, if she wasn't cooperative, she'd wake up the whole household and they would chase him away, because that was part of the game, that if you got caught sneaking in there, then the father or the brothers could go chase you out and try and catch you and embarrass you, but it wasn't real serious. And most of the time, in the evenings, the young people would just go out, the teenagers would just go out to the far side of the island. See, there were usually two sides to the island. The inner side of the island faced the lagoon. See, a lagoon is an atoll, is a big circle of coral. And there's a lagoon in the middle, and the island is in a sort of a crescent shape around the lagoon. So there's the side of the island that faces into the lagoon where the water is calm, and that's where the village is. That's where they take their fishing boats out from, and so forth. And then the island is covered with brush, jungle, various vegetation, but there are trails through it. And you go through there and you get out to the beach on the back side of the island that faces the open ocean. And there's a certain amount of coral reef out there, and there are waves breaking on the coral reef, and then there's a small space of calm water between the reef and the island and the beach. And so the young people would meet on the beach, build a little fire there, see, and their parents are all asleep, a quarter of a mile away over on the other side of the island. And they know the kids are out there, and they don't care. And particularly they do this on moonlit nights when there's plenty of light. And they have, a fire there, and they have some drums, some logs to beat sticks on to make drums with, and they can dance, and they can have little dances, and it just wouldn't be very many people, might be half a dozen people, and if the dancing, if it got them turned on, and they felt like it, they could go off into the bushes, and there were little cleared out spaces like little rooms. And you could go back in through the bushes to a little room there and have sex back there and have some privacy. And, the parents knew about this and they didn't worry about it. If a woman got pregnant, if a young woman got pregnant, this was not considered anything shameful. this was considered as a good proof that she was going to be a good mother, was going to be a woman who was capable of having babies. And so that was in her favor. And when the baby was born, she would give the baby to her parents. They might give it to another family. There was always a family that enjoyed having another baby to take care of because they loved babies. And so there was always one family or another who would take care of the baby, and the mother would be right there in the same village as the baby was growing up in the other family, so she would know the child. And then, she would eventually find a husband and get married to him. Or she might marry the man that she got pregnant with, the young man she got pregnant with. And if a marriage didn't work out, it was no big deal. The young man went back to his parents' house, or the young woman went back to her parents' house, and then eventually they found other partners. In such a situation like that, people, would have perhaps between 2 and 3 marriages in their life. And also in a situation where they didn't have to worry about sexually transmitted diseases. In the afternoons, adults who wanted to have a relationship with someone who wasn't their husband or wife would meet out on the beach and have an affair out on the beach with someone. So they had a little bit of sexual variety in their life as well. And this was all accepted. Nobody got upset about this. And life was harmonious. And way back at the beginning of life, when children were going through their period of childhood, sexual exploration, during the day, while the adults were doing their stuff, the men were fishing or working in the gardens, and the women were, weaving tapa cloths and doing other things, and husking coconuts and pounding out poi and stuff like that. All the adults had plenty of stuff to do during the day, and it was a very social occasion. They would, work and sociality went together. They were, nobody was on the time clock. Nobody was working for a boss. Everybody was their own employer, so to speak. But they would, be working in groups. And so they had plenty, they could talk and laugh and play and take a break whenever they wanted to, and not feel like somebody was always looking over their shoulder to see if they were working hard enough. So anyway, the adults had plenty of stuff to do during the day. And they couldn't keep an eye on the kids. And the kids didn't have to go to school. This was before the coming of European civilization. They didn't need to learn to read and write. They were going to learn all the skills that they needed in life just from watching the adults and participating along with the adults in whatever it was the adults did. They were automatically going to learn by doing all the skills that they would need to learn. And so the young kids were not in school. They were running around the island in a group. They were like the republic of the children, so to speak. They had their own little subculture, their own society. And so the adults could not supervise their sexual play and could not prevent them from playing together sexually any way they wanted to. And they would play house. They would imitate having sexual intercourse, and then the girl would imitate having a baby in her tummy, and then she would give birth because all the children were allowed to be present at every occasion when a woman gave birth in the village. Giving birth was a public entertainment, you might say. It was a public event. The woman was in the middle of a hut. There was a rope that hung down from the main beam of the hut, from the roof, and she was holding onto that and squatting, over obviously a mat or something like that. And there was someone there ready to catch the baby when the baby came out. And there was always a group of villagers around watching, sending good vibes and helping this happen as easily as possible. And I think squatting position like that is probably a natural and good position for giving birth, because you've got gravity helping you draw the child out. And the women's bodies were probably quite limber, so that childbirth wasn't as painful as it is for us, probably. But in any case, all the kids were allowed to be present there. And when there was too big a crowd and the people in the back couldn't see what was going on, there would always be someone there who would give sort of a play-by-play announcement, description of the whole process, and describe how far along it's going. Okay, we can see the head now coming out. All right, the moment's here. Okay, all right, here's the baby, mama. So that they would let everybody know what was happening, so nobody would feel like they were left out of this community event. This is one of the more exciting things in the days before television, you know. You found your entertainment where you could. So the kids knew about how babies were born, and they knew about how babies were made, because they all grew up in a house where their parents had sex right there in the same room with them. Their parents were across the way and they just slept on mats, and it was warm enough that they didn't need blankets or anything, so they were just naked on the mats. So the parents would be over there in the dark having sex, and the kids could, watch and see what was going on, and the parents didn't mind that, until the kids got so excited and found it so funny, they started giggling and making funny little comments back and forth, which became distracting to the parents, at which point the parents would say, be quiet, put your heads under your mats, and go to sleep, just because they were distracting the parents. But if the kids watched quietly, the parents didn't care. And occasionally they would have public parties where they might have sexual entertainers. There was a group of traveling entertainers in the Tahitian Islands who went around performing for local groups. They would perform plays and skits, comedy and so forth. They were traveling entertainers, and then they would perform sexual activities as entertainment for the people to watch, and then they might have sex with the villagers. That was the society called the Arioi Society. But most villages didn't have that, but they did have feasts. They would have like a fishing contest a couple times a year, where the men went out for a period of several days to see which group could catch the most fish, and they were divided into villages. There were 3 villages, let's say, on one island, and each village had its own team of fishermen, and they went out for several days to catch as many fish as they could and bring them back, so that everybody could have this big feast, and everybody would have all kinds of food to eat. Before they went fishing and while they went fishing, the men had to abstain from sex, so that they had as much energy for the fishing, as they possibly could have. Sort of like football players not having sex the night before a game. So the men, by the end of the fishing contest, when they declared the winner and they divided up the fish and everybody had a big feast, the guys were horny by then because they hadn't had sex for a while. And so at the end of the feast, as the evening goes on, they're probably drinking coconut brandy and having a good time, and they would have a sort of a sexual free-for-all as a feast for that, as the ending of the festival, let's say. And nobody was allowed to criticize anybody for having sex with anybody on that particular occasion. It was like no rules for this one evening. And once again, that's okay to do if you have an isolated community where you don't have sexually transmitted diseases. But as soon as you have sexually transmitted diseases come into the situation, then that kind of sexual freedom rapidly results in the spread of sexually transmitted diseases throughout the population. But in any case, I'm trying to describe what would be the perfect ideal situation for developing a sex-positive sexual development, sexual history, and sexual response to life. That the kind of sexual history we would want would be one where the whole culture is completely supportive of sexual pleasure, believing that sexual pleasure is one of the great things in life, and that we should create opportunities where we can enjoy sexual pleasure as much as possible, and that everybody has the right to enjoy sexual pleasure without any judgment from somebody else as to whether they're enjoying it the right way or not. Whatever we as individuals enjoy is the right way for us to enjoy sexuality. As long as we're not imposing our sexual desires on someone else who doesn't have the same sexual desires. We should always have partners who want to participate in our sexual activity just as much as we ourselves do, and not be taking advantage of somebody else. But my point was, for children, not only did they have the chance to play together and imitate sex together, they had actually seen sex from the earliest days onward. From their youngest days onward, sex was a part of the environment. It was not a secret, it was not hidden, and it wasn't something special that you had to go to a special channel or a special site on the internet to find, some segregated site where you had to find sex, and it was kind of forbidden for children. It was completely forbidden for children to go there. No, there was nothing like that. See, one of the most important aspects of a healthy sexual environment for development is to have sex-positive attitudes among the adults. That the adults themselves feel no guilt about satisfying their own natural sex drive in the most pleasurable way they possibly can, and so they feel no need to make their children feel bad in any way for satisfying their sexual needs and desires in the way that they themselves want to do. Wilhelm Reich, R-E-I-C-H, proper pronunciation Reich, Wilhelm Reich, the Austrian psychoanalyst who was like the father of pleasurology, he said that children should be self-determining sexually. Children should be sexually self-determining. They should determine their own sexual activities. Adults should not determine the sexual activities that children engage in, neither by prohibiting them from engaging in sexual activities or persuading children to engage in sexual activities that the adults want to do but the children wouldn't think of doing. No, Reich said, leave the children alone, let them decide for themselves how they want to play and interact sexually with other people. So in Polynesia, there was, right from the beginning of a person's life, a sexually supportive, sex-positive social environment that made it possible for them to have an abundance of sexual activity, sexual knowledge, sexual erotic interaction with each other in a way that was not harmful to anybody. How are kids going to harm each other? By playing at sex with each other? The adults did not view sex as being harmful to children. They didn't see that at all. And in contrast to the way that our society says, just the opposite. Our society, particularly the dinosaur culture before the sexual revolution, said, children must be protected from sexual knowledge, from even knowing what sex is, and from all kinds of sexual stimulation. Protect them from it and keep it from them so that they won't start using their sex drive before they get married. They shouldn't use their sex drive at all until they get married. So what that means is that ideally, for them, the ideal thing would be that children and young people and teenagers would have no sexual learning, zero sexual learning, until marriage. Sexual learning in terms of actual sexual experience. That their emotional brains would never become sexually aroused until they got married. And then all of a sudden, everything is supposed to work perfectly. After they've been told all up until that time that if they become sexually active, do anything sexual at all, even by themselves, even just in their mind, in their fantasies, that they are being sinful and immoral and bad. So that's a recipe for pathological sexuality. That's a recipe for a harmed development of sexuality, an injured development of sexuality. And that was closer to what I had myself in my own life. But anyway, next time I'll tell you a little bit more about my own personal sexual history and why the experiences that I had, the few experiences that I had, led me to develop strong sexual preferences that were very well satisfied by going to the nude beach. That my early childhood development led me to the nude beach as a really good place to enjoy myself sexually. Okay, I'll talk to you again next time. Thank you for listening.